people are angry. People are angry at someone like Blankfein, the CEO of Goldman Sachs, who at one stage said, "I'm doing God's work." So the compensation caps with regard only to banks who had gotten TARP funding, this is sort of a short-term political device rather than a long-term battlefront, which the president seems to have launched with his 0.15% fee on bank liabilities. I will not go into the derivatives and over-the-counter derivatives and the credit default swaps and the hedge fund regulation, but in the remaining 4 minutes, I will discuss the Wall Street reform and the Consumer Protection Act passed by the House of Representatives, which will now go to the Senate, and then it will go to the conference, and then it will be, if it's passed by Congress, then it will be signed by the President sometime, maybe in the spring of 2010. But what were the proposals? What are the proposals of this bill? The proposals relate to the capital adequacy ratio for the banks, which makes sense, and it also says that there is going to be a Council of Federal Regulators, which will not only impose these capital adequacy ratios on the banks, but also use a special $150 billion fund for dissolving any large and highly complex, risk-prone financial company. So there's going to be a new agency which can dissolve a financial company, not GE, which is essentially a manufacturing company, not Pitney Bowes, another company. They have been exempted, but banks. The second one relates to the Consumer Financial Protection Agency, which the President is hung up on. Will it go through? I think it's an additional bureaucracy, and I would be very surprised if the Senate passes the Consumer Protection Agency, which is devised to protect consumers from the mortgage dangers. Compensation of Wall Street executives? No. Let the board of directors of banks manage it. Government should not be regulating compensation of bank executives. Of course, there will be taxes, but no restriction by government policies on that. Derivative and hedge fund regulation, the U.S. hedge fund regulation proposals are on the whole quite modest and sensible in my view as compared to some of the European proposals I have been looking at. The U.S. is, okay, they should register, they should report their activities to a special committee which will be confidential, but no further restrictions about size and whether they should be big, large, and that kind of regulation. So will that prevent another bubble? Well, I think the capital adequacy requirement and the transparent screening by the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Commodity Finance Trading Commission, and the requirement that a troubled financial unit can be dissolved. If they are implemented, then it could help in preventing another crisis. The Federal Reserve, is not going to be a systemic regulator. It will remain in charge of monetary policy and part of the regulatory setup. Finally, I mean, will all these proposals, if implemented, prevent a bubble? If they are implemented, maybe yes, they have been watered down already. But this is a system where entrepreneurial and innovative activity, and the less the regulations, the better off we are. That kind of a cultural and mental setup in the United States we have to be living with these crises. Schumpeter said that. My former teacher at MIT, Charlie Kindleberger, said that. And so next time around, maybe the volatility will be less. Next time around, maybe the federal regulations will come into act sooner and more effectively. And that is not a very bright message I'm going to leave you with, but there I'm going to stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Padma. Thank you. Now I invite Dr. Santiago Levy, who is the Vice President for Sectors and Knowledge at the Inter-American Development Bank. Thank you, Santiago.
Good morning. I want to begin by thanking Jerry and Dr. Cedillo for inviting me to this panel. My remarks are mostly going to be from the perspective of Latin America, which is a region of the world that I know most. And it's probably good to begin with some good news, which is that by and large, Latin America in the past crisis did much better than what would have expected, and did much better than certainly it did in previous crises. For the region as a whole, the GDP on average came down by 2%, and it's expected this year in 2010 to rebound to plus 4%. And if you take away Mexico from these numbers, which is a special case, the region actually, GDP came down even less, and it's going to rebound even more in 2010. So the first good news is that Latin America on the whole did really well. Why? And that will lead me to the issue of international financial architecture. An interesting fact about the 2008-2009 crisis compared to the previous crisis is that if you look at the MB measures of spread and measures of risk, surprisingly, the MB measures in the period running from September 2008 through more or less February 2009, which are the 6 months in which the crisis was most acute, actually the MB spreads are lower than in previous crises in Latin America, for instance, in the Russian crisis and the long-term capital management crisis of '98. In the 6 months, if you compare 6 months to 6 months, and here I'm quoting research of two colleagues of mine at the IDB, Ernesto Talvi and Alejandro Izquierdo, what they show is that spreads are lower, which is a puzzling fact because the crisis in 2008-2009 was much larger, and you would expect the opposite. So the answer to that is, in general, well, Latin America had much better fundamentals in the 2008-2009 crisis compared to before, and the much better fundamentals in the way of lower current account deficits, lower fiscal deficits, flexible exchange rates, more autonomous central banks, and whatnot, really make the fundamental difference in this crisis compared to the previous crisis. But Izquierdo and Talvi go a little bit further, and it's interesting to do slowly the exercise that they did. They say, all right, well, let's try to isolate the effect of fundamentals and really answer the question, is it fundamentals only, or was there something else that explains the puzzling fact that the region did much better in this case than in the previous case, and that MB spreads were much lower than in previous crises, despite the fact that the world crisis was actually much larger. So they compare countries with strong fundamentals, the MB spreads, with countries with weak fundamentals, and they find, as expected, that countries with strong fundamentals had much lower MB spreads than countries with weak fundamentals. But surprisingly, they also find that countries with weak fundamentals did much better in the 2008-2009 crisis than in the '98 crisis. So the point here is that fundamentals do not explain everything. Yes, they played a major role in isolating the region from a major crisis, but they do not explain fully the story as to why the region did so well compared to the past. So the other factor that comes into play is that in this crisis, as opposed to previous crises, the response of the international financial community to the crisis was very different from the ways it was in the past. Recall that after the Lehman collapse, right after that, the Federal Reserve established swap lines with Singapore, with Korea, with Brazil, and with Mexico for about $30 billion each. And recall that a few months after that, the International Monetary Fund established a new system of flexible credit lines and support for countries. And recall that a few months after that, the G20 actually increased the capital of the IMF to about $1 trillion. So what was different in 2008-2009 compared to previous crises from the perspective of Latin America was not only that fundamentals were much better, they were, but that there was, first, much more money in the international system, and secondly, that the nature of these resources was different from the resources in the past.